today I'm going to be giving a talk, which is a chapter in progress from my book, titled They Define the World Differently, Decolonization and the Making of the New African Woman. And I'm going to just give you a little brief description of my book, which is titled A Nation of Prostitutes, Gender Policing, and the Invention of Zimbabwe. And in this book, I argue that the prostitute is a discursive figure through which colonial spatial logics are reproduced in post-independence Africa. And I examine key moments in which the prostitute is conjured by the state and citizens alike, informing public debates about how urban space, the law, and the state itself ought to be remade in the wake of colonial rule. So what you're going to listen to today is a chapter 2 of that book. And the book is coming soon. As yet undecided date, because I have to finish it. Okay, so I want to set up a scene for you. Okay, imagine the scene. A diplomatic debacle of the highest order. The year is 1986. We are 7 years into the Iranian Revolution and 6 years into the Iraq-Iran war. President Ali Khamenei is on a tour of Africa, and he makes a stop in Zimbabwe, newly independent after 90 years of colonial occupation. Its Prime Minister, Robert Mugabe, bespectacled and, as will be remarked upon many times, articulate, is the newly elected chair of the Non-Aligned Movement. That September, Zimbabwe will play host to the 8th Non-Aligned, forgot to turn this on. All right. 8th, oh, okay. Ooh. 8th, does it actually matter?
Yes.
Oh, it does. Oh, okay. To the 8th Non-Aligned Summit. And a new hotel has been constructed near the city's business district to accommodate the illustrious guests. For example, Fidel Castro was there, all the post-colonial stars were there. So this moment in post-coloniality will be interrupted by Black women, or at least that's what the headlines will announce the next day. Suits have been pressed, 2 lambs have been ritually slaughtered, and the police band has been brought in to entertain the Iranian delegation. But after a brief appearance, the guests return to their hotel rooms, displeased by the party. According to the coverage, they object to the wine being served, the music, and most of all, the presence of 2 female government ministers at the dinner. Negotiations hastily take place in the middle of the dinner to rectify this breach in diplomatic protocol. Unnamed sources will reveal that these negotiations go all the way to the top and that a call is placed to Ayatollah Khomeini back in Iran. But the guests are not placated. A senior member of the Zimbabwe government writes an impromptu statement on the back of his dinner menu, of all things, the contents of which will circulate in international press, used as evidence of a clash between an emergent, modern Africa and an Iran that has slid back into the past. The statement reads, the traditional state banquet, which was to have been hosted this evening by President Banana for the visiting Iranian president, has been canceled. Of particular significance was the Iranian objection to the proposed seating arrangements for women guests and to the serving of wine. The major role played by Zimbabwean women during the War of Liberation and the role they continue to play in the overall development of our country entitle them to an equal status and standing in every respect with their male counterparts, a principle on which the government of Zimbabwe is unable and indeed unwilling to compromise. So this talk is going to explore why Black women were apparently so important to the nation state at this specific historical moment that they could interrupt diplomatic relations. To me, the fact that Black women could have this power is not actually self-evident. Another way to put this would be, how does the category of women, which we understand not as trans-historical, but one that emerges in particular sites at particular junctures, surface as a category that can drive discourse and compel political action at this particular moment? I'm going to do so by providing an account of the figure called the New African Woman, who was an important part of anti-colonial discourse of the 20th century. My aim in this talk is to situate the emergence of the New African Woman as a legible category within the cross-current of 2 movements: the Black internationalist solidarity campaigns of the late 20th century and the ascendant third world women's movement. In this talk, we'll see how the invention of the new African woman points to the challenges and contradictions of the anti-colonial imperative to make things new. Her gendered and racialized body becomes a scythe through which the central question which animated decolonization movements is worked out, namely how to invent new political, social, and cultural forms, new ways of being in the world that negate the violence of colonial rule. And I want to point out that there's no singular vision of the new African woman. She's invoked by the colonial state, male nationalists, Marxist-Leninist revolutionaries, African writers, and intellectuals. Okay, so a very, very brief history of this figure. And of course, this is not an accounting of the different ways she appeared in different nationalist movements. I write about Zimbabwe, so this is going to focus primarily on Zimbabwe, with some important detours into South Africa and Mozambique for reasons which will become apparent. So, an important precursor of the new African woman is a figure called the good time girl. The good time girl is connected to consumer culture of the mid-20th century. This is Parade magazine, which was a magazine that circulated in Central Africa, circulated in Rhodesia, which was the name for Zimbabwe before it was decolonized. And she is a consumer of colonial commodities. She's also heavily tied to kind of Western aesthetics. She is sexually liberated, and the key part is that she's a product of urbanization. So the idea was urbanization was driving the creation of these good time girls who were straying away from traditional values. And an artifact that I recently found digging through some archives is this book that is published by the Rhodesian Girl Guides Association, and Girl Guides are Girl Scouts, so that's what they're called in the Anglophone, well, the British colonies. So the Girl Guides Association publishes this book, and the title of it is called Jamazuva Ano Chimanje Manje, which means things of today. And Chimanje Manje is a reduplicated noun that speaks to now. So if you're talking to your friend and saying, I'm coming manje manje, you're saying, I'm coming now. So Chimanje Manje is a special temporal concept, right? It speaks to what the historian Moses Chikowere calls Afro-modernity, and the idea that these young girls were fashioning kind of Afro-modernity that rested on the now. So you can see our good time girl is wearing a mini skirt. She has a wig on, so the wigs were a huge issue. Has a wig on, she's got a purse, and she's turning her back and walking away from tradition, right? And there's a traditional figure in the back, and she's of the now, of today, turning her back on tradition. And when this book was originally titled, it was called Ourselves and the Boys, or Isusunyo Akomana. And then the Rhodesia Literature Bureau changes the title and calls it Jamazuva Ano Chimanje Manje, which is a comment on the perceived corrosive effect of modernity on young African girls. So for me, this figure is an important precursor to the new African woman. In part, and this is something that I'm teasing out in my book, in part the idea that African women are something to be fashioned into something else, right? That African women are deficient and that there must always be projects to create them into new kind of figures. So the good time girl is being made into a new modern figure, one who consumes appropriately, one who is urban, right? And there are a lot of anxieties in the colonial state about this figure. So she's not necessarily a happy figure. As you can see, this is a book that is published to dissuade young girls, actually, from becoming this kind of girl. So the book is about taking care of yourself, not having sex with too many boys, not being disrespectful to your parents. So the overall message is you may be urbanized, but don't forget your past. So this is a precursor to what I'm calling the new African woman. And in contrast to the good time girl, who was ensnared in consumer culture, nationalist movements invoked a new woman who would emerge from the crumbling edifice of racial colonial oppression. Right? Anne McClintock observes that nationalists frequently argued that colonialism or capitalism has been women's ruin, and patriarchy is a nasty second cousin that is destined to wither away when the real villain finally expires. So instead of being the good time girl, the new woman was educated, she was decorous, she was decent. She was intelligent, but she was not insubordinate. And her comportment was informed by a cultural nationalism that framed sexual impropriety as evidence of the disruptive influence of colonialism on traditional life. In contrast to images of savagery, the new woman's decency and elegance were markers of the inherent nobility of the race, a key idea advanced by nationalist movements. So the emergence of the new woman freed from patriarchy was part of the larger project of cultural regeneration on which many anti-colonial movements were premised. She is cast in the future, and yet she's already present, emerging as part of the politics of the anti-colonial movement. Visions of the liberated woman to come were prevalent across the decolonizing world. For example, Partha Chatterjee writes about Indian nationalism, where he observes that the new woman, quote, was quite the reverse of the common woman, who was coarse, vulgar, loud, quarrelsome, devoid of superior moral sense, sexually promiscuous, subjected to brutal physical oppression by males. Across Africa, the emergence of the new woman was premised on the undoing of customary law in particular. So we still have the idea that tradition is something that must be abandoned. So even though the new woman is opposed to the good time girl, you still have this idea that tradition is backwards and must be reformed. So that idea remains intact with the emergence of the new woman. And nationalists and anti-colonial revolutionaries alike recognized codified customary law as a colonial invention and frequently announced their desire to reform it at independence. To be liberated from colonial time and space was necessarily be liberated from customary law, which fixed Africans in a fabricated ancient past. Since women were symbols of the nation to come, there could be no post-colonial temporality if women were not liberated from the immobilizing effects of customary law. So a key place where this is developed for me is in the writing that Frantz Fanon does, over the course of several works, right? And in the essay, Algeria Unveiled, which appears in A Dying Colonialism, he talks about what it means for Algerian women to enter into revolutionary struggle and what it means for them to use the veil in a way that subverts colonial logics, right? The idea of the veiled woman as subjugated. And he specifically is interested in what it means for the veiled woman to enter into colonial spaces, to enter into the colonial city, hiding arms on her body, using her body in a subversive way. And this became a key phrase for my thinking about what the new woman is and what she becomes. And Fanon says that the Algerian woman who walks stark naked into the European city, this is the key line for me, relearns her body, reestablishes it in a totally revolutionary fashion. So the new woman relearns her body, right? Reestablishes it in a totally revolutionary fashion. And we're going to talk more about what it means to reestablish your body in a revolutionary fashion. So in Fanon's writing, we see the idea that war is a process of invention, a process that produces new subjectivities. And we see this also in the cultural production, right, that accompanies the decolonization movement. And a key point that I want to make here is that Zimbabwe is what we call a late decolonizer, right? Zimbabwe decolonizes in 1980, well after the year of decolonization, where African countries decolonized in, not all of them, 1960, right? So the production that I'm talking about takes place largely in the 70s and 80s. So for example, the film Sambizanga by the Guadeloupean director, Sarah Malador, who marries an Angolan writer, depicts a woman who is in search of her husband in the city of Luanda, who is a revolutionary who's been arrested by the Portuguese. And the film kind of documents her entrance into the colonial city and the ways in which she kind of becomes radicalized by the way that her husband has been captured and contained by the colonial system. So this is a key scene where she's wailing, right, totally kind of in this completely unleashed fashion because she finds out that her husband has been taken. And spoiler, it's not really important, her husband dies, right? So we see here that the emergence of the new African woman is premised on this idea that war is inherently radicalizing, and that in particular, war changes embodiment, right? That part of becoming new people through struggle is our very bodies are transformed by this process of revolutionary struggle. So this image for me really speaks to that, how it becomes a fully embodied process, becoming new citizens, becoming new subjects. But we always gotta throw a wrench into the thing, because it's not just the revolutionaries or the nationalists who are creating the new woman or crediting themselves with this creation. The colonial state at the same time is itself crediting itself with the creation of this figure. So this is an image from a newspaper called The African Times, which despite the title was not actually made by Africans. It was a propaganda newspaper that was written for Black people, but written by the colonial state in Zimbabwe. And you see here in 1968, a very revolutionary year. So they know revolution is in the air, but they want to co-opt that revolutionary fervor, and they say, we are actually part of what they call a social revolution that is taking place in gender relations. So here the colonial state heralds the arrival of the new woman, and instead of attributing her emergence to revolutionary struggle, which they of course oppose because it's against them, they attribute it to the kinds of social engineering programs that they are sponsoring. So they were sponsoring things like women's clubs, right? When women would get together, they'd be taught things like how to be properly domestic, how to cook, hygiene, how to take care of children, right? So you see pictures from those women's clubs. They would send nurses out to villages where they would educate young mothers on how to take care of their children, right? So in the colonial state's eyes, this is the new woman. So they are co-opting this term and saying, we are part of that production of this new figure, and we are empowering African women, right, as the struggle was going on. So lots of people are laying claim to the new woman. And for me, the most significant articulation of the new woman comes through guerrilla struggle, and in particular, because of the context that I work in, comes through the work that Frelimo, which is the Liberation Front of Mozambique, does to create this mythology. So Mozambique is a Portuguese colony until 1975. And Frelimo is a Marxist-Leninist party that engages in guerrilla struggle. And we can talk a little bit more about Frelimo in the Q&A if you'd like. And this is an image of Jacina Mutemba Machel. And Jacina she comes from a family of political revolutionaries. Her uncle, her father, all of them are involved in the struggle. And she joins Frelimo as a student. And she quickly rises in the ranks because she's seen as incredibly committed and audacious in the struggle. And part of what she is credited with is advocating the full inclusion of women in Frelimo's struggle. And of course, her last name is very famous. Yes, some people have heard, maybe? Because she marries Samora Machel, who eventually becomes president of Frelimo, and then at Mozambique's independence in 1975, becomes Mozambique's first president. Now, Jacina dies at 25 years old in 1971, very young, of liver cancer. And upon her death, her husband, who is the president of Frelimo, writes the poem, "Jacina, you are not dead." And in the poem, he says, "My joy is that as patriot and woman, you died doubly free in this time when the new power and the new woman are emerging." So Josina becomes an incredibly important figure in the struggles that I'm interested in because she's sort of becomes the archetypical new woman. And she, her death, right, makes her even more symbolic of this kind of figure, right? She's educated, she's revolutionary, she's committed to the struggle, and she is articulating the idea that women must be involved in the struggle as equal participants. And Mozambique's struggle becomes hugely influential in Zimbabwe because at this time, Zimbabwe itself, right, I won't get into the parties, that's sort of besides the point. But one of the main parties in Zimbabwe is ZANU-PF. And it takes on a Marxist-Leninist bent and collaborates with Frelimo. So for Mozambique, we get into Zimbabwe, and ZANU-PF picks up a lot of Frelimo's thinking about women, about capitalism, about the state, all sorts of things. But this key idea that women must be involved in the struggle influences ZANU-PF's own messaging. So we create our own new woman, and her name is Joyce Nongo Mujuru. And her name in the war, so every person received a name in the war to make them anonymous. Her name is Teorai Ropa, which means spill blood. And I love that. Like, imagine you're in the war, like, I'm spill blood. So that was her name. Her name was Spill Blood. And you can see here immediately, we see the same aesthetics, right? Depicted in much similar fashion to Josina. So Teorai Ropa is captioned even, right, as the new woman tempered by struggle will rebuild Zimbabwe. So Teorai Ropa is initially, when independence comes in 1980, she's initially Minister of Youth, Sports and Cultural Recreation. And then when the Ministry of Women's Affairs is created a year later, she becomes the first minister, and she becomes a government minister at 25. So when I was doing my dissertation, I interviewed her, and I was still in my 20s, I'm old now. And she was like, how old are you? And I was like, I'm 27. She was like, I became a minister when I was your age. I was just like you, I was a baby like you. So she becomes a minister at this age. She went to the struggle as a teen. She went when she was like 17. So this is a really short span of time in which she becomes a really important figure in Zimbabwean politics. And I want to mention the publication in which, images of the new woman circulate. So part of what's happening in this moment is that there are all these material aid campaigns throughout the West that are supporting struggles in South Africa, Namibia, Angola, right? Mozambique before it becomes independent. And they're producing this wealth of documents, right, that are documenting the struggle. And there are these networks of activists in New York, in LA, in Berkeley, in Nordic countries, right, who are producing all these documents. And so this is where a lot of my material comes from. And this is actually important because it shows us that there is a circulation of a certain kind of discourse and a certain imagining of what the revolution looks like. So the new woman is key to how the revolution is being imagined in the West. And some historians have quibbled with this because they're like, yes, they're painting the revolution as a feminist one because they want Americans to give money, right? They want Westerners to be like, yes, this is a feminist thing. So part of it is intentional, right? They want to appeal to audiences in the West. And I'm not so skeptical about what these representations do. But anyway, part of the publication, right, we have essays, we have images, we have accountings of what's going on the war front. And we're getting a deeper sense of what the new woman means in the struggle. So we have an essay here by Mabel Mudondo, who was a ZANU-PF member who was in exile in the United States. And she was one of the people who was creating these networks. She would go from place to place, giving speeches, collecting donations, I read one document where they were asking for jeans, right? Like, what do women wear in battle? They need jeans, they need boots, they need tampons, right? Those are the kinds of things that she would ask for when she was giving these speeches. So she writes an essay in the same publication where she talks about, right, explains to the audience what is happening in the struggle. And she tells them that today in the Chimurenga, which is the liberation war, we see the emergence of a new type of Zimbabwean woman, right? She's free from the servant mentality of the communal feudal society and from the slave mentality of colonialism. The new Zimbabwean woman would have to liberate herself entirely from the chains which bound her to a life of depravity and degradation. And then we read on, and we read that her influence in society will be constructive, creative, and beautiful. And when I read this, I was like, this sounds exactly like Fanon. The language is actually really strikingly similar to the way that Fanon talks about the new woman of the Algerian struggle. So that was striking to me, and I thought, this is a question that I should answer as someone who's interested in, like, are they reading Fanon at this moment? Is he translated? So we see that there's this romantic vision of what the new woman will do and how she will transform Zimbabwean society. And intellectuals are a key part of how this vision is disseminated. So here we have Naomi Mudiwa, and she is a professor. She's also in exile, and she lives in the US. She's a professor. She got her PhD at NYU in communication. And throughout the 70s and 80s, because of her activities, she lives in the United States. And she also goes around and gives speeches to American audiences, right, seeking funds on behalf of women in the struggle. And in 1979, ZANU-PF hosts a women's seminar, which was this historic event where they bring women together. They bring together soldiers, intellectuals, to talk about, right, the issue of women. So this speech that I'm going to quote from in the image that you see, she has just returned from this like amazing historic event, right? Imagine in the midst of struggle, you have just a conference bringing together guerrilla fighters, intellectuals. The president himself shows up, and you're talking about the problem of women. And she comes back to the US and she's reporting on what happened during this historic seminar that takes place in Mozambique. And a key thing about her is that she's also one of the women that the Iranians refused to sit with. So this is how she reappears in the narrative. So at independence, she's now part of government, and she's one of the women that the Iranians are like, no, please. So anyway, she's giving these speeches talking about what's happened in Maputo. And the speech I'm going to quote from is at an event organized by the New York Material Aid Campaign for ZANU. And she talks here about how the Women's Conference had given her an intimate encounter with the new woman of the struggle. And she's like so enraptured by this new feminist creature. And she says in this speech, they are a different species. Quote, they think differently, they see differently. And by her own admission, she says, because she's a professor, so you know how professors are. She says, I'd come to this conference acting, a little bit important. And part of what had happened, because they're socialists, they're like, no one is going to get a special room. So the intellectuals and the soldiers share rooms. So that was like, a thing. So she's sharing a room with a soldier, and she starts talking to her. And she says, quote, says, I'm reading from this, it was a transforming experience. I can never tell you how good it was. It was intoxicating with good feelings. It was something to meet the comrades, the cadres. Each one of us had to room with a soldier, with a female soldier, with a cadre. So I spent like 2 weeks with the soldiers to hear the stories, and I teach in the university, and I was acting, a little bit important. She didn't envy my life at all. She felt sorry for me. It was that I had the opportunity to learn indeed what was inside her, that indeed I wasn't free. She was free. She showed me marks of where she was hurt, where she escaped. Some of these girls escaped Chimoyo, Nyazonya, which were attacks on guerrilla camps by the Rhodesian state. When I talked some of these things, I thought I was being important, but she would think of me differently. No, they were very dedicated. They were free because they said this was one of the things that they would be very glad to die doing, because this was the most important. So the new woman becomes this romantic figure on which the anti-colonial struggle hinges on, right? She is free, she's freer than the intellectuals even, right? And we see then how this figure starts to circulate in discourses, in publications that are aimed at women. So in the last part of this talk, I want to talk about how this figure starts to circulate, both as part of a discourse and then important because Fanon says, right, reestablishes the body in a revolutionary fashion. We see how the new woman also becomes an important aesthetic. So there's one publication that I'm obsessed with right now that I'm thinking through this with, and it's a publication, I'll go back to that, publication called Africa Woman. Oh, this, thank you. Yeah, of course, I mean, hey, no problem. I'm happy to help, just interrupt my lecture. Okay, so the Africa Woman is a publication that is one of the ways where we see the new woman circulating. And the publication begins in 1975. And its first issue appears after the World Conference on Women, which happens in Mexico City. And I think this is actually quite significant. So I had my little 1975 moment here. Because 1975, lots of important things happen, in my view. That's the year that Mozambique becomes independent. Connected to that, and because of that, because Mozambique is now a free country, it is now kind of open territory for revolutionaries in Zimbabwe to stage their war efforts from, right? Because they were not allowed to do so when the Portuguese ran the country. So that means that the war effort in Zimbabwe intensifies because they're not able to go back and forth across the border easily. And that is also the year that they explicitly kind of encourage women to join in combat. They were not doing that before, but 1975, girls go en masse to like join the effort. And I've talked to my mom about this because my mom was like 15 at the time. And she told me a story where she said, my school friend and I were like, we're gonna go join the struggle. So they're at school. And we said, we're gonna meet after school at this point, and you had to get on a bus, go into Mozambique, cross the border. And it was very difficult because if they caught you, you'd get in big trouble because they were trying to discourage girls from doing it. She was like, we're gonna do it. And then I was like, so what happened? And she was like, oh, I just didn't show up. So like that is my bloodline, just a line of flakers. So she was just like, I just didn't go. So anyway, that's why I'm here though. So so it's also International Women's Year. So this is the year, an important year marking kind of like the way that third world feminism takes center stage. And subsequently the beginning of what is called the UN Decade for Women. So we see the way that revolutionary struggle and like feminism kind of meet in 1975, especially in respect to what we call third world women. So this publication is part of that moment. It's established in 1975, and it's just a fascinating publication. It is trying to do this mix of politics and aesthetics, and it features, right, every cover kind of features an important woman in African politics. We may recognize this person here. Do we know this person? Okay, all right, take my classes. Okay, so this person, that's Winnie Mandela, right? An important revolutionary figure in her own right. And so the magazine features African women, right, articulating kind of like their vision of what their place in the struggle is. And it's really tempting to call this a feminist magazine because I would love to say that. But actually what's more interesting is that in this magazine, we see feminism itself being worked out as a term. So we see like debates about like what does it mean for us as Black women in this moment to call ourselves, right, feminists. And a lot of women that they profile are like explicitly rejecting the term, right? These are like revolutionary women who are engaged in struggle, who are doing things that we would recognize as feminist, and they're like, no, I'm not part of that movement. So we have one Nigerian lawyer, Aduke Alakija, who is profiled in the magazine, and she says, From what I read in the newspaper, it seems like the lib, they used to call it women's lib, wants to enslave men rather than liberate women, if I may put it that way. So in this magazine, we not only see the new woman being articulated, but important for me is that there is a key distinguishing from like the project of the new woman from Western feminism, right? They're not saying like this is part of Western feminism. And so there's a letter that somebody writes to this publication in 1976 where he says, "The word liberation must never be in our dictionary because traditional African women have always been liberated. Both the men and women are complementary and there's never been any misunderstanding between them and us. We must not allow foreign elements to sow seeds of dissension among us." So people are saying feminism doesn't apply to us because we never had those problems, right? Which I would take a quibble of true with that. But in any case, it's important to understand like when we historicize this, that there's actually a clear disagreement with the feminist movement that's unfolding in the West and what the project of the new African woman is. So so here you kind of see some of this is an issue on fashion, and you see, right, the idea that part of what the new woman calls for is a revolutionary aesthetic. So you see the caption at the top, the editor writes, and the editor is Taiwo Ajayi, "Is no longer considered eccentric for fashion-conscious people in most of the world's great cities to deck themselves in clothing ostensibly inspired by models from Africa." So the idea that this moment calls for a new aesthetic, right, that is liberated from Western ideals. So hair becomes important here, right? The clothing becomes important. So remember the essay by Memo Mudondo, the one that I thought sounded like Fanon? So exciting! Scholarship is so exciting. This essay actually first appears in Africa Woman. So I was like, when I found that out, I was so jazzed. So it first appears actually in Africa Woman. So a key part of what's happening in this moment, which is really interesting for people who study print culture, is actually that these essays are often copied and circulate in different publications. And they change. So when it appears in Africa Woman, it does not have the passage that I cited, right? Mabel's not radicalized yet. She's kind of like, you know. So it has, and I read them side by side, it has everything else except for the passage that I cited. So it first appears in 1975. The version that I cited appears in 1979, right? So you see how this magazine is kind of like an important node in this network of new African women, right, discourse. So Mabel initially publishes her article in this form, and then it gets picked up by the party. She changes and edits it, and then it circulates in Western publications that are supporting the war. Really fascinating to me. So I want to close by thinking about a figure who helps us kind of tie this together. So one of the covers of the magazine features the South African singer Miriam Makeba. And she, is now known as an influential jazz musician. And she's a singer from South Africa, from the township of Sophiatown. And her international debut is in the 1959 film Come Back Africa, where this is an amazing scene. This film, just a really rich text where the men are discussing politics, they're having all these conversations, and she's a township girl, and she walks in the room in this gorgeous dress, and she sings this beautiful song, right? Kind of like this visual sonic interruption of men's important political discourse. So Miriam Makeba is a figure through which we can trace the creation of the new woman. Because in the 50s, right, she is singing in clubs in Sophiatown. She's a musician, and in many ways, she fits the archetype of the good time girl, right? She's part of this culture that both the colonial state and the nationalists derided. This culture that existed in places we call shebeens, which were like little kind of like homemade clubs, right? And throughout the 60s and 70s, she eventually comes to the US and she becomes linked to other Black revolutionary artists like Harriet Belafonte, who just passed away. And she becomes a key figure in, right, the global Black consciousness movement. She becomes a vocal critic of apartheid, and just like an incredibly, right, we don't say seminal anymore because it's not about semen, foundational figure in Black politics. And in the profile written of her in this magazine, Louis Nkosi, who is another important South African writer, writes about her as, quote, the symbol of the new African woman, proud, articulate, self-aware, and above all, determined to carry out her political and social responsibilities which her fame and success have enabled her to shoulder. And boy, when I found this, I was like, again, I'm always like experiencing ecstasy and like when I find documents. Striking to me that one of the images used to illustrate, right, her evolution is this photograph where she looks like Josina and looks like Stillblood, right? And I don't know where this image is from. That's actually, I'm trying to like source, like where is it from? Next to her is, yes, okay, we got it, right? And she marries him in, what, did she marry this man? 1968. So she marries Kwame Ture in 1968, they don't last, right? And because she marries him, so she was this jazz musician, she was singing in US venues across the country. You know, people loved her. Oh, this exotic African young woman, she's so beautiful, right? And when she marries Kwame Ture, she is now essentially, you know, there's essentially like a blacklist on her because now she's associated with this radical figure, right? And it's something that she does knowing that it's going to cost her career. So she moves then to Europe at some point, and then she eventually settles in Guinea because she cannot get work in the US anymore because of her association with the Black Power movement. And so I love that this image kind of like references, right, and puts her in visual conversation with the other women that we've seen. And I love the evolution from this image, which is what like puts her on the map internationally. So this is how she enters mainstream consciousness in this film made by an American director. And then this is her evolution as a public figure, right? From good time girl to the new woman. Where are my notes? So I wanted to close by playing just a little bit of a performance that she does, and this song has been like one of the songs I listen to constantly as I'm writing and thinking. So we've established that 1975, hugely important year because we see the merging of this ascendant feminist movement, third world feminist movement, and then the radicalization of anti-colonial struggle in Zimbabwe, primarily because Mozambique becomes independent. So in light of this historic moment, Miriam Makeba writes a song. Actually, her daughter writes a song. She's going to talk about it. I won't talk, she will talk about it. So let's listen to her talk about it.
The song that was written by my teacher. She wrote it for me after I had the honor. And the chance of being chosen as one of the delegates from the capital the independence celebrations of Mozambique. It was in Mozambique that I first heard the words in Portuguese, "Aluta continua." When I came back, I was bonding over what I saw and 5 minutes on to write the song. We have the habit of dedicating it to the people of Mozambique and to the Aranda party playing on and to the beloved Summer Machete. My people, open your eyes and down the door.
Okay. So I wanted to leave you with the sound, with the image of Miriam Makeba, because to me this represents the remarkable promise, right, that the new African woman embodied. And she is at once a romantic, mythic figure, but she's also embodied by the women who took on arms, right, who raised funds, who put their bodies on the line for the struggle. That this project rested on Black women, an oppressed class under colonialism, can show us, right, that this project to create new subjectivities, new ways of moving and being in the world, new forms of relation to each other, right, is unfinished, but it's still important. And for me, the sources that I examine here, Thank you. The music, the writing, the film point to a project that is incomplete, but if hopefully, right, these are also resources that allow us to carry this project on. And that's it. Thank you for your time and attention.